It was a cool night in November of 1910 when several men who traveled from different areas all arrived at a New Jersey train station. They acted as if they didn't know each other, but quietly boarded a private train car that was tucked out of sight, detached from the rest of the train. The men were instructed to avoid interacting with reporters or each other and to use only their more common first names, Ben, Paul, or Frank, when in the presence of the train's servants, further concealing their identities. Through the darkness, the train backed into a hidden car, coupling with a subtle jolt. Inside were the men who held a quarter of the world's wealth, yet to the other passengers, their presence was nothing more than a subtle bump. Passenger and owner of the car, Senator Nelson Aldrich, was chairman of the National Monetary Commission and had close ties to J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers. Among him was Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank of New York, the most powerful bank at the time. Abraham Andrew, the assistant secretary of the U.S. Treasury. Henry Davidson, senior partner for J.P. Morgan. Charles Norton, president of J.P. Morgan's First National Bank in New York. Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, and Paul Warburg, a representative of the Rothschilds banking dynasty and Kuhn and Loeb partner. One of Paul Warburg's brothers, Max, was the financial advisor of the Kaiser and director of the Reich Bank in Germany, which years later created hyperinflation that wiped out the middle class and the entire German economy. All of these men were on a secret trip to Jekyll Island to create the Federal Reserve. 20 years after, Frank Vanderlip would write about one of the main reasons for their secrecy in an article called From Farm Boy to Financier. He said, "If it were to be exposed publicly that a particular group had gotten together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatsoever of passage by Congress." Just after their trip to Jekyll Island, the Titanic was financed by J.P. Morgan. He and other prominent bankers such as George Vanderbilt withdrew from the voyage at the last minute. However, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and Jacob Astor IV, some of the wealthiest men who were opposed to the Federal Reserve, were aboard the Titanic when it sank on April 15th of 1912. Before the establishment of the Fed in 1913, U.S. citizens didn't pay taxes, so one must wonder why the April 15th anniversary of the Titanic sinking became the day that taxes are due in the United States. It's almost as if paying taxes are a form of homage to the event that forever changed the course of humanity. So when I recall what Rosie Rios said in 2021, 111 years after the train left for Jekyll Island, her comment that the train has left the station hits a little different. In order for either of these trains to leave the station, there had to be a plan for where the train was going. The most recent plan to create Bitcoin was born from the 2008 financial crisis.
The heightened financial turmoil that we have experienced of late may well lengthen the period of weak economic performance and further increase the risk to growth.
In the heat of the crisis, currency stopped flowing through the system as it normally would because many of the assets held by financial institutions were suddenly worthless, which left them unable to pay for their liabilities. In response, the Treasury created the Toxic Asset Relief Program. Supported by the Fed, it allowed a bailout of the financial sector by taxpayers rather than letting the system fail for its irresponsible lending practices. Bank reserves were used to buy all the garbage that was no longer worth anything. To be clear, this was systemically important garbage because the assets represented everybody's mortgages, loans, debt obligations, and more. Interestingly enough, Bitcoin's white paper was written in the depths of the financial crisis, and in theory, its use case actually would have solved the liquidity issue the system faced. With Bitcoin, they would have been able to transfer the assets on-chain, and it could have been done in a timely manner, allowing value to flow. Because of the immutability of the blockchain, it could keep accurate timestamps and maintain perfect accountability of the assets amidst the crisis. Ironically, Bitcoin was associated with an anti-bank movement and criminal activity in its inception, which created the notion that blockchain itself would never be a useful application for banks. Rather, it would bring an end to banking as we knew it. In contrast to the hard money image that Bitcoin grew to represent, Satoshi's original emails with early Bitcoin dev Marty Malmy discussed using Bitcoin's elastic value to bootstrap the network, much like how banks leverage deposits in a fractional reserve system. Creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, said, "Theoretically, imagine 10 businesses have their eye on a $100 bill being offered for their Bitcoin, but don't actually cash out because they know it's there if they need it. That one $100 bill allowed 10 different people to act like their Bitcoins were equivalent to $100. which actually highlighted the benefits of leveraging people's money in the same method that central banks already used. So surely this parallel to central banking was a one-off comment that we should all take as a grain of salt, right? Well, Satoshi imagined a big future for Bitcoin, believing it from the start it would protect people from monopolistic central banks. Despite the failures of many digital currencies before it, he speculated it could have a dot-com style growth rate and made forecasts between Bitcoin and Visa, suggesting that Bitcoin could scale beyond Visa for a fraction of the cost. So clearly it seemed like he wanted to compete with the banks. He knew such growth might result in fees on the network, but he said the fees would be distributed evenly and not monopolized to a banking elite. Perhaps, though, the look of the banker is what changes the most. Over time, those who control the hashing power become the new elite, and Bitcoin can transform into a modernized central bank. After the panic of 1907, Vanderlip and the other bankers needed to find common ground because the financial system was experiencing an increased number of bank failures due to liquidity issues. The creation of the Federal Reserve was initially supported by the public because it was not perceived as a central bank. Instead, it was viewed as a decentralized system of banks, distancing itself from the notion of central banking. This mirrors how Bitcoin was initially embraced, not as a centralized entity, but as a decentralized system. Even the name Federal Reserve did not imply it was run by a banking elite. Federal made it sound like it was a government entity operating for the benefit of the public through complete transparency, while Reserve made their operations sound safe, as though they held all your deposits in a vault, which they don't. The blueprint for the Fed required all banks to issue loans in the same ratio as each other, so that when they traded assets, their assets and liabilities would balance. It was known that the entire financial system might collapse under such arrangement, but the members of the Federal Reserve System would be protected. When crises hit, they could put the blame on the economy, bad government policy, interest rates, the dollar, trade, or the capitalist system itself. Everyone was assured that the Federal Reserve would benefit commerce by using interest rates to stabilize the economy, enable withdrawals from multiple banks, and prevent banking crises. Once the system was established, they would blame a scapegoat if they lost control. Through these tactics, a thick smokescreen was laid to get the public's approval. If they weren't convinced, they would be hit with a barrage of technical jargon to confuse skeptics into submission. So, let me ask, what's the first thing Grandma says to you when you start ranting about how a blockchain operates on a decentralized network of nodes leveraging computational power to hash cryptographic proofs, execute consensus algorithms, and validate transactions? Does she simply agree that it's the future of finance? Or is this the explanation you used to explain yourself after she called you a FOMO for buying magic internet money? The rise of crypto rhymes with the origins of the Fed, and both creators wanted their image to be distanced from monopolistic banks. And while many have tried to guess who Satoshi Nakamoto is, nobody knows for certain. One of the more convincing ideas to me is that Satoshi is a group of people acting secretly under a single name. In fact, the white paper even starts out by saying "we," when at the time it was published in Halloween night of 2008, Satoshi was the only known person working on Bitcoin. Whether he's real or not, though, it is widely believed he is using a pseudonym, and no personal information was ever revealed to dispute that. Satoshi is riddled in mystery as deep as the Fed, and he gave more examples of his need for extreme secrecy in his emails with Marty. As they were looking for a way to bootstrap the network's value, Satoshi informed Marty that there are donors I can tap if we come up with something that needs funding, but they want to be anonymous. Keep in mind this donor is not an investor and would have no expectations of profit. Marty welcomes the idea of the donor, and soon enough, Satoshi says that he will be able to send the money in the form of cash in the mail. He asks Marty if this is okay, and Marty points out that sending cash in the mail is risky, but acknowledges it is the best anonymous option. Before the donation arrives, Satoshi reiterates several times that the identity of the donor must be kept private. Marty soon gets a donation of $3,500 in the mail, which was given primarily to pay website fees, but also to provide liquidity to their new Bitcoin exchange by backing a small amount of Bitcoin to $1,000 cash. Satoshi was, in essence, the exact opposite of a transparent actor. Yet, even after the highly anonymous cash donation was sent through the mail, Satoshi wavered on his anonymity stance in regards to Bitcoin. He told Marty he wanted to de-emphasize the anonymous angle that was spotlighting Bitcoin on the website. He said, "Advertising Bitcoin as anonymous sounds a bit shady. People who want to be anonymous will still figure it out without us trumpeting it." So here's Satoshi, acting shady, but smashing down any thought of Bitcoin being marketed as anonymous, while continuing on saying that he doesn't want people to think that it's not anonymous either, as anonymous seekers would assume it were, based on the other attributes like no central authority to take your ID info and the way Bitcoin addresses look. That is confusing. This all funnels into one of the first major use cases of Bitcoin being a method of payment on the Silk Road, and how taking it down helped law enforcement learn how to track on-chain transactions. Satoshi indeed mentioned bootstrapping Bitcoin's value through a market that was similar to eBay. Many users of the Silk Road believe Bitcoin was anonymous, but being vague about this on the Bitcoin site left it open to interpretation. It was as if they were suggesting that Bitcoin could be used for illegal activities, but without explicitly endorsing such uses, it covered their tracks. This is exactly the kind of move that a certain intelligence agency might use to foster adoption and bootstrap the value of a currency while simultaneously exploring methods of tracing it. Such an approach could further suggest a connection between Satoshi and a government entity. Just as the Federal Reserve used the term federal to build trust and distance itself from private elite bankers, Bitcoin cultivated its anti-establishment image through its involvement with criminal activities. One of the key reasons why many digital currencies before Bitcoin failed was due to their failure to adhere to Know Your Customer, KYC, and anti-money laundering, AML laws. The use of Bitcoin on the Silk Road helped give importance to KYC and AML in crypto. These regulations are also critical in the financial industry to prevent illegal activities such as money laundering, terrorist financing, and fraud. In early 2011, 3 developers, David Schwartz, Jed McCaleb, and Arthur Brito, sought to create a more sustainable system for sending value than Bitcoin, which brought the birth of the XRP ledger. It was designed to facilitate faster and cheaper payments and use a fraction of the energy Bitcoin required. After it launched, NewCoin was founded, which quickly rebranded to OpenCoin, which became Ripple. Ripple is the first crypto company that has held a stance somewhat opposite to early Bitcoiners in that they are transparent actors that value KYC AML laws and seek to work within existing regulations. Because of this, most of the crypto community seems personally offended Ripple even exists. They argue that it's the opposite of what crypto really is about, but just the same as the Fed, all the more perceptive bankers are clued in and know what's going on. Oddly enough, Satoshi expressed the opposite sentiment towards Ripple that he seemed to create. When Marty asked Satoshi what his thoughts on Ripple were, Satoshi said, "Ripple is interesting in that it's the only other system that does something with trust besides concentrate it into a central server." So naturally, if Satoshi really is the godfather of crypto, it would seem that people would give Ripple or XRP the time of day, but they don't. Another forum dweller also asked Satoshi if he's heard of Ripple, and Satoshi reiterates, "As trust systems go, Ripple is unique in spreading trust around rather than concentrating it." Yet despite frequently talking about Liberty reserves and citing other digital currencies in the white paper, Satoshi seems annoyed with this, saying, "I've been asked at least 4 times, have you heard of Ripple?" And of all the currencies ever mentioned by Satoshi, Ripple is the only one that he praised, yet tried to divert attention from. Typically, the digital currencies that Satoshi called attention to were ones that had flaws, such as Hashcash, eGold, and especially Liberty reserves. In his email to Marty, he suggested creating a way to swap Bitcoin for Liberty reserves, but it never seemed to come into fruition. Several years later, in 2013, Liberty Reserve's founder, Arthur Budlowski, went to jail for operating an unlicensed financial transaction company and money laundering. If you didn't know, Ripple also has an anonymous Satoshi-like figure. Arthur Brito, one of the actual founders of the XRPL, seems to be a pseudonym as well. While Brito is a main Ripple dev on Twitter and allegedly a real person according to David Schwartz, he has never posted on X, doesn't have any photos, and aside from a few comments here and there, he's otherwise a literal ghost. So strangely enough, both Ripple and Satoshi had an Arthur B in their sphere of influence. This mysterious character follows 2 people on Twitter, one of whom is Roger Ver, the author of a book which discusses how governments and powerful entities might co-opt Bitcoin over time. Were the ideas in this book known before the creation of the XRP ledger, or was its fully transparent release merely a response to the broader necessity for integrating its technology into the financial system? And that's where we encounter the next layer of mystery, a transparent actor enveloped in the same enigma as the Fed and Bitcoin. Ripple has a CEO, seeks to work within regulations, and everyone knows they want to be the next gen bank. Funny enough, Marty mentioned the usefulness of such a company to handle bureaucracy, but Satoshi largely ignores the idea. Yet despite all of this, the fact that Ripple is actually doing it is why they're unpopular. There's also a saying that bad news is good news, so the fact XRP was arguably given some of the worst news in the space could suggest it was actually because it had a bright future ahead of it. Of course, everyone knows about the trial of the century involving Ripple and their alleged security, XRP. 589 weeks after Judge Torres assumed office, she deemed XRP was in fact not a security. While this wasn't the first lawsuit involving alleged crypto securities, it was by far the most popularized. XRP was placed in the spotlight, likely because they want people to pay attention to it. For whatever reason, it was chosen first to receive legal clarity on the world stage. And while putting something on the spotlight might seem to be the opposite of discretion and secrecy, that might be the point. Indeed, sometimes the best place to hide something big is in plain sight. So is XRP meant to actually emerge as the true anti-establishment coin? It has indeed carried the bad boy image for a while now, Ripple having been sued by the SEC and placed on the world stage to be mocked, ridiculed, and outperformed by dog coins, all while creating an empire in legal dominance with unparalleled trust and transparency that could bring serious competition to JP Morgan and the like, and while Bitcoin is now being pushed by politicians. The list of secrets goes on, though, and despite being explained in a legally verifiable way, the original Genesis transactions of the XRPL and the first week's worth of transactions up to ledger 32,570 were erased due to a bug. This is explained in a thread by David Schwartz. The current version of the XRPL has never been halted or forked, but because of this bug, we'll probably never know who the Genesis transactions were to. In that sense, the origins of the XRPL are somewhat anonymous too. Dating back to Neolithic times, the triskele is one of the oldest symbols in the world. From an esoteric perspective, Ripple's triskelion is linked with sacred knowledge and triad concepts such as past, present, and future, birth, life, and death, as well as mind, body, and spirit. When you think of a triskele, think of a triangle. And when you think of a triangle, think of the Freemason symbol. It is made of a compass and a square, which each have 3 points, like a triangle. When this triangle is merged together, it creates the Star of David, which is shown multiple times on the US dollar bill. Now think about the Ripple logo in relation to the triangles. They're a perfect match. And while the connecting line of the XRP logo is missing, the triangle can be imagined. So similar to the triangles in the Star of David, when the halves of the XRP logo are combined, an X is formed. Now pay attention to the Star of David that's shown on the dollar bill. When it's replicated over the Great Seal, the tips of the triangles point to the letters MASON, and that directly ties all of that into the financial system. Everything is hidden in plain sight. The compass is also evident in the street layout of Washington, D.C., and a mirrored version of the new X logo also echoes this shape. Additionally, the planetary alignment at Bitcoin's inception can form a triangle, and according to financial astrologers, this isn't a coincidence. This was planned. So it seems the Freemasons are still alive and love to show it. This could perhaps shine a light on why Satoshi Nakamoto allegedly published a book in 2019 titled Wave and Ripple Design Book. Each website that sells it, including Google Books, attributes the work to the same Satoshi that created Bitcoin. There's even a message in the beginning that describes how Satoshi used an independent curator to assist him in publishing the designs, and it mentions the methods used to preserve his anonymity were straight out of a spy novel. While the book is mostly constructed of Yuzan Daidoji's designs, within it are 2 haikus, which read, 5 cured kippers dance, wild stallion hooves ripple, only one true north. Treasure within sight, but to wealth a great distance, set waves in motion. If this really was curated for Satoshi, why would he draw attention to Ripple so heavily? And why would its message echo the sentiments of Bearable Guy, promising a future of treasure and eventual wealth by following the one true north? Notice the star out the window. And why would David Schwartz own a copy of the book and post the proof on Twitter if he didn't want you to see it? Perhaps now, people are more than ever motivated to seek economic liberty and willing to adopt a new system outside of the central bank monopoly, just as people in the 1910s believed they were doing too. Wealth is a great incentive for people to favor crypto, and perhaps that desire will make the transition into the new system as seamless as when the Fed took over in 1913. It was all based on the hope that the new thing in town was better. Now we see charismatic leaders like Trump emerging on the scene in favor of creating a national Bitcoin stockpile, and Senator Loomis suggesting that they'll use the stockpile to pay down the national debt. It all sounds great for the price of Bitcoin until you realize taxpayers are the exit liquidity. Think about it. For every buyer, there's a seller, and people that buy positive news are likely average Joes that are manipulated into thinking that the government's involvement will make them rich. If this happens, what's really going on is another covert bailout that leverages hopes and dreams to pay down the national debt. Just like 2020, 2008, and every other financial crisis in the history of the Fed, taxpayers will foot the bill. So if the government is going to be buying and selling crypto, it would have similar effects as raising and lowering the interest rates. If they're pumping the prices up, it's the equivalent to lowering interest rates without saying so. If they lower prices, it's the same as raising rates by making money more expensive. Similar things have been done in the past. The US had a growing stockpile of gold and was systematically redeeming greenbacks issued during the Civil War to pay down the national debt. This effectively lowered interest rates, intervening in the free market to favor spending and debt over savings. The shift led to inflation, and I think the reality is these sleights of hand will continue until the system breaks. Truly, a replacement system that people can rally behind is needed. Leveraging rising prices and the central bank's stupidity as fuel for adoption could serve as powerful motivation. Remember, the Bitcoin white paper was published during the 2008 financial crisis, a time when many were losing their homes due to the banking system failures. A solution emerging from such an event likely reflects a deep understanding of the financial system and an awareness of the impending civil unrest. Like an elite few, Satoshi might have recognized the gravity of the situation, as he seemed to know the system had broken in 2008, and Bitcoin might be the hard money solution that people would need. He said, "Most of the value in money comes from the value that others place in it. History shows that whether naturally or through influence, whatever people believe in, including seashells, will prevail." In the creation of the Federal Reserve, the public didn't have a hint that there was a master plan underneath it all to serve private interests at their expense. The establishment of the new system simply brought the promise of a more resilient financial system, and that was enough. More perceptive bankers were well aware it was designed to favor the banks instead, and I think that's where we're at now. A few years back, I stumbled into this document on the Fed's website, which highlighted considerations for effective partnerships between fintech companies and banks. All three qualities are shown by Ripple, and the diagram itself is their logo. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 under the U.S. Constitution states that any coin that is not authorized by Congress would technically be illegal. It gives Congress the exclusive power to coin money and regulate its value. This means that only coins minted or authorized by Congress are considered legal currency in the United States. So it could make sense that Bitcoin might have been construed as illegal in some capacity, and perhaps it was initially needed to be kept secret to get the crypto movement off the ground. In that sense, using an anonymous test before launching the real network would be useful in preserving the company that was intended to carry out the final mission. Despite the polarity between the Bitcoin and XRP communities, Satoshi's original idea for his Bitcoin logo actually foreshadowed some of the elements of the Ripple logo too. While discussing what logo to use for Bitcoin, Satoshi says, "Maybe it's just me, but I really like the random blue squares." As you can see, the original Bitcoin logo had 3 shades of blue in the background. This is especially odd considering the Ripple logo is blue with 3 points. It might seem like a stretch until you realize Satoshi originally wanted the Bitcoin site to look something like a banking site to inspire confidence and professionalism. He mentioned that trying something besides blue was merely an experiment and that he was actually biased to the color blue for fostering trust. Think of how many companies' logos are blue and how Ripple has always used a blue logo. It's likely because it's clear they do not want to experiment with the trust aspect of their business. Or even crazier, if you look at a color wheel, the Bitcoin and Ripple logos as we know it are in exact opposite corners of the color wheel. Was this intentional to create subliminal division amongst the communities? Even one of Satoshi's passwords included 589. Even if these passwords were randomly generated, ChatGPT estimated the odds of 589 being included as a whole number within the sequence was 1 in 39,727, or 0.02%, which means there's a good chance it was intentional. Perhaps Satoshi's potential knowledge of securities laws could tie him in with Ripple too. When Marty suggested making a Bitcoin exchange, Satoshi said, "I don't want to do an exchange business myself, but it can be done independently of me." And later in the email, Satoshi continuously refers to it as your exchange. He made it clear he wanted distance between himself and the exchange. Then, when the donation money arrived, Marty asked Satoshi, "What do you think about offering rewards of $100 to $200 for the first 5 to 10 established companies that start accepting Bitcoin? We'd also assign them a dedicated support person to help with integration, and that we could also make the offer public." Satoshi immediately advises against this, remarking, $100 to $200 is chump change if they're a serious company. It would only make us sound small. What they need most is confidence they can convert it to fiat currency. Had they gone through with it, it's possible that Bitcoin could have also been construed as a securities offering, as the arrangement would have involved the efforts of others, a common enterprise, and the expectation of profits. It also emphasizes why the donation money was specifically labeled as a donation. So Satoshi might have been aware of securities laws as far back as 2009, which likely wasn't on many people's radar back then. I imagine if it actually worked and created growth in the ecosystem, the SEC would have all they needed to start a lawsuit, minus the creator's identity. So they seem to cover their tracks well. Similarly, Ripple were gifted 80 billion XRP from the Open Coin Foundation, which kept Ripple at arm's length to XRP. By that, both founders were distanced from the tokens themselves, just as the Fed distanced itself from the image of a bank. All three seem to share the same fingerprints. Also, by 2009, despite Marty being new to Bitcoin, he was concerned about how it would scale. He asked about low overhead, which in this context is referring to the time it takes to send a Bitcoin, and Marty noticed the problem with waiting an hour for a Bitcoin transaction to clear. Indeed, this issue would need to be solved to be useful in interbank settlement, as blockchain was likely intended to complement. Marty also expressed concerns over the potential carbon dioxide emissions from Bitcoin, which are now more than the entire country of Norway. Satoshi said that it would be ironic if we had to end up choosing between economic liberty and conservation. Control of the new system seems increasingly tied to energy usage, and in a time when sustainability is a major focus, a network that operates with minimum energy consumption could have serious leverage on the world stage. Scalability, environmental resource demand, latency, and identity verification were all concerns with Bitcoin in the early stages, and they were all solved in 2012 when XRP arrived as a solution. The lawsuit was intentional to establish XRP as the first non-security. Its status is a plain as day, indisputable fact, while the status of Bitcoin is seemingly secure, yet vague. And while Bitcoin will likely continue to be seen as a non-security, that fact is only as strong as the concealment of Satoshi's identity. Chances are we will never know, and that's by design. When asked about how the total supply of 21 million Bitcoin was decided, Satoshi simply stated that it was an educated guess. He believed this number would also allow the network to scale beyond Visa. However, he imagined that the fees associated with the transactions would remain small enough even for micropayments, but they haven't. This implies that Bitcoin was never intended to become as big as it has, or that he made a miscalculation in how big it would become. Perhaps, though, maybe it never mattered, and the total supply was more of a symbolic nod to the esoteric, and his apparent miscalculation was not accidental. Consider the idea that 21 million can be reduced to 21 using numerology, and Bitcoin connects to Saturn as they are both connected to the number 21. And if you didn't already know, the elites love Saturn. Saturn itself has a 6-sided hexagon and can be divided into 6 equilateral triangles, which has particular significance when we consider that 21 is also the 6th pyramid number. In other words, when each million Bitcoin are stacked, they can create a pyramid using 6 as the base. The same goes for XRP's 100 billion. This reduces to the number 1, which is the first triangular number. It might seem confusing how 1 forms a triangle, but it's because 1 is the sum of the first number, which is represented by the mathematical equation. If yet another pyramid influenced Satoshi's educated guess, it wouldn't be surprising given the extensive similarities they share with the existing system. All emerge from secrecy, leverage the illusion of opposites to their advantage, and seemingly address the needs of the banking system. They follow the time-tested pattern of problem, reaction, solution, test, trust, and adoption. So perhaps we know who the real creators are.